Question is Chancellor of the Exchequer. Order. Question is Chancellor of the Exchequer. I call Chancellor Sunak to answer a substantive question, number 1 from Andrew Gwynne. Chancellor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I'd like to answer this question together with questions 2 and 3. Earlier this month, I announced that businesses forced to close as a result of local restrictions will be eligible for a grant of up to £3,000 per month. Their employees will be protected through the expanded job support programme, and their councils will receive extra resources to help with local track and trace and enforcement and compliance.
Let us go to Greater Manchester with Andrew Gwynne. Andrew Gwynne.
Thank you. All that Greater Manchester is asking for is proper financial support for our businesses, our self-employed and our lowest paid after 12 weeks of failed lockdown measures and as we face many more uncertain months ahead. When the Prime Minister's reported as struggling to live on his £150,000 a year salary, how does he think the lowest paid in Greater Manchester will cope on 2/3 of national minimum wage? And last night, the Communities Secretary offered just £22 million for a city region of 2.8 million people. That's less than the £25 million he granted to his own town centre. Why does this government hate Greater Manchester?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, it's disappointing to hear the right honourable gentleman's tone. It's obviously a very difficult time for many people in this country as we evolve our response to this virus. But what we need is people acting in a constructive spirit, and that's what my right honourable friend, the Community Secretary, is actively offering to do, and I hope those conversations are happening as we speak. Greater Manchester is being treated exactly the same as every part of our United Kingdom. These are national support schemes that have put in place that help the most vulnerable in our society. He raised a number of questions. As he will know, there are national schemes to protect businesses, to protect employees, and to provide support to his local authority.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Repeated local lockdowns with no end in sight is killing our economy in South Shields. In the last lockdown, we received £26 million of support. I've been advised the financial package offered to us this time, should we end up in Tier 3, would be just over £1 million. Can he confirm or deny this insulting amount?
Mr. Speaker, I'm glad the Honourable Lady recognises the economic damage that lockdowns do, which is why when we had this debate last week, I did pose the question as to why the party opposite was suggesting a national lockdown with no end in sight, without commenting on the damage that would do to people's jobs and livelihoods. With respect to support for local authorities entering in Tier 3, as I set out, there is a national funding formula that provides a per capita amount to the local authority of up to £8 per head at the highest tier to provide support for local enforcement, compliance and track and trace. On top of that, there's support that the national government provides for businesses who are closed. Their employees can be put on the job support scheme. And in addition, my right honourable friend, the Community Secretary, can talk to local authorities about providing bespoke extra support as required.
Heading back to Greater Manchester with Afzal Khan. Afzal Khan.
Mr. Speaker, people and businesses in my constituency in Cross Greater Manchester are suffering. They are facing an uncertain winter with insufficient support. Last night, the government offered just £22 million to the 2.8 million people in Greater Manchester. That comes to just £8 a head to support local people and businesses during the months ahead. Other areas were given double this number, despite having just half the population. Does the Minister seriously believe this is a fair deal for Greater Manchester? And if so, would he like to take this opportunity to apologise to those Mancunians who will or already have lost their livelihoods?
Mr. Speaker, I think with the greatest respect, the honourable gentleman is mistaken in his characterisation of the support provided and confusing two different things. He's absolutely right. The support is £8 per head. That is the national funding formula that is provided to all local authorities entering Tier 3. That is the same as is provided in Lancashire and indeed in the Liverpool City region. And that's the amount that he refers to, which is done on an equitable basis for all local authorities. The additional amounts he talks about were reached in negotiation with my right honourable friend, the Community Secretary and representatives of the government. That offer remains available to Greater Manchester, and which is why I hope they engage in these negotiations constructively.
We now head to the Chair of the Select Committee, Mel Stride.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend has done a great deal to support jobs in our country, but he will know that lockdowns destroy jobs, lead to increased mental illness and to a smaller economy that for many years will be less able to look after our most vulnerable. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that the government should come forward urgently with a comprehensive review of the impact of lockdowns, not just in terms of epidemiology and the effect on the NHS, important though that is, but also on the economy, on businesses and on jobs and the country's social well-being?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as ever, my right honourable friend makes an excellent point, and he's right about the damage not just to non-COVID health outcomes, but also to people's jobs, livelihoods, and the long-term damage that that will have on all our health outcomes. With regard to projections of that, he will know that whether it's the OBR or the IMF, they project 3% scarring, which will mean our economy being potentially 70 to 80 billion pounds smaller in the future than it otherwise would have been. That will obviously, as he rightly says, have a consequent impact on our ability to fund public services and protect people's jobs and livelihoods.
Now comes the Shadow Chancellor and the Least Dons.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, when the Prime Minister was asked whether a circuit breaker was likely, he said that I rule nothing out. Does the Chancellor rule it out, yes or no? Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, of course, I agree with the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That appears slightly different from the message we received from the Chancellor last week. Now, this morning, a member of the Monetary Policy Committee stated that the bulk of spending reductions are due to restrictions that people voluntarily impose on themselves. Higher virus prevalence is associated with weaker economic performance. Research suggests that not undertaking a circuit breaker now could cost our economy an additional £110 billion. That's based on IMF figures, by the way, due to changes in behaviour people make to avoid contracting the virus and the knock-on impact of those on economic output. So can I ask the Chancellor, what is his estimate of the costs of not undertaking a circuit breaker and continuing with this rolling programme of regional restrictions? Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady talks about rolling programmes. It's very clear that the party opposite believe we should have a rolling programme of national lockdowns. What I can tell her is that would be enormously damaging for people's jobs and livelihoods, causing unnecessary pain and suffering on those in parts of the country where virus prevalence is low. A localised approach is the best approach.
We're now going up to Scotland to the SNP spokesperson, Alison Thewlis. Alison Thewlis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are not in a significantly different public health position now than when the Chancellor announced furlough on the 20th of March. Pubs and restaurants, hospitality venues are being asked to close, but this time he's leaving people with significantly less support. Will he take action today to extend the furlough scheme to make sure that people are protected and make sure that those who have lost out and have been excluded from support can be included this time?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, we have announced the job support scheme, which will take effect on the 1st of November following the closure of the CJRS. That ensures that those who are working in closed businesses can be placed on that scheme, receive 67% of their wages, an amount comparable to all our European peers, at very little if no expense to the employer, helping them to protect those jobs.
Returning to Alison Thewlis. Alison Thewlis.
67% of wages for people who are on minimum wage jobs, the lowest paid in our society, is simply not good enough and gives them absolutely no incentive to self-isolate and stick to the rules. The Scottish Government has announced a grant of £500 to the lowest paid, but this UK Government may swipe that back and pick the pockets of the poorest in taxation. Will he go further than he has done so far and exempt this £500 grant to the poorest in our society from taxation?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady talks about the Scottish Government introducing a £500 grant. I think it was the UK Government who introduced the £500 grant and provided Barnett funding for the Scottish Government to do the same. And she's right, though, that that grant payment is there to help those who are most vulnerable so that they can isolate and provides an incentive for them to do so.
That's Kieran Millen.
Aye, Mr. Speaker.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I should like to answer this question together with questions 10, 11, 12 and 13.
The government recognises that the pandemic has caused extreme disruption to the economy. That is why we have delivered one of the most comprehensive and generous support packages anywhere in the world, worth over £190 billion.
Dr. Kieran.
Thank you. Can I begin by recognising the enormous amount of support that has been given to businesses in Crewe and Nantwich? I've spoken to many of them that would not have survived without it, and I know the pressure on public finances, but hospitality businesses like the one I visited, Giovanni's in Crewe, are really going to struggle with the 10 p.m. curfew and the ban on household mixing. Can we look again at what we might be able to do for businesses that might technically be allowed to open, but are going to struggle under those kind of circumstances?
My honourable friend is right that there has been disruption to businesses affected by Tier 2. That is why my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, has cut VAT from 20% to 5% and extended that to the 31st of March, and also why he has introduced a 12-month business rates holiday.
Speaker, over the last few days, businesses across Burnley and Padiham, from bookkeepers to bars and pubs, have had to close as the County of Lancashire has entered Tier 3 restrictions. Whilst those businesses are very welcome at getting the support government has provided with the extension of furlough and business grants, there are many more in the supply chain who will be equally as impacted because their end suppliers aren't there. So could my right honourable friend set out what measures are available to support them as they go through the next couple of weeks and months?
Minister.
As a Lancastrian myself, I'm acutely aware of the impact on the County of Lancashire. It's why my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Local Government, negotiated the additional business support, and that builds on the measures set out by the Chancellor to support businesses, not just through the job support scheme, but also through the furlough bonus.
Caroline Noakes.
Mr. Speaker, it's not just businesses in Tiers 2 and 3 that have been impacted. In Tier 1, some sectors are still unable to trade, suffering from a total loss of business. Does my right honourable friend agree with the head of the IMF that now is not the time to balance the books, and will he consider extending support to businesses that still cannot work in these times?
Well, my honourable friend is right in terms of the pressure on businesses within Tier 1 as well, and that is why amongst the package the Chancellor set out has been the extension of loan facilities to help those businesses with their cash flow. And within the South East region that my honourable friend represents, that totals £7.5 billion of support.
Many thousands of small businesses have already benefited from the measures that my right honourable friend and his colleagues have put in place. And as we move forward, can I urge him to keep a small business focus, particularly for small brewers? Duty levels are a crucial part of their business viability, and can I urge him to keep small brewers duty relief in place as it is, helping to safeguard the future of many small breweries, not just in Hampshire but throughout the United Kingdom?
Well, my right honourable friend makes an extremely valid point in terms of the impact on that particular sector, and that is why the Treasury is reviewing small business brewers' relief, and indeed the Exchequer Secretary has taken forward reforms at the industry's request to fix issues in the current relief design.
We have a substantive question from Joanna Cherry to Minister Glenn.
Since 2010, the government set up a payment scheme to make payments of up to £1.5 billion to eligible policyholders. Since the scheme closed in 2016, the government's position on this issue has been clear. There is no further funding in addition to that £1.5 billion, and this issue is considered closed.
Going to Scotland with Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many self-employed people and small business owners feel let down by the COVID response. And the same type of people were let down 10 years ago today when victims of the Equitable Life scandal were told they were only going to get 22% of the money they lost. The Treasury has ignored hard-working people like my constituents for a decade. So please will the Chancellor reconsider and commit to providing Equitable Life victims with the compensation they deserve?
Well, the government continues to pay out to annuitants who were in payment from 2010, and indeed have a £100 million contingency in order to ensure that they are properly provided for. The government was completely transparent about the calculation methodology, and worked with the action group, the Equitable Life Action Group, to give explanations to policyholders. And we met with actuaries to ensure that it was as fair as it possibly could be. So the government's position on this remains as I stated.
We have a substantive question to Minister Burnham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government is providing an extra £33.9 billion to the NHS to deliver its long-term plan, which has actions to tackle inequalities affecting women and girls. This includes commitments to 50% reductions in stillbirth, maternal mortality and neonatal mortality by 2025, increasing access to perinatal mental health services and expanding HPV vaccination to protect against cervical cancer, amongst many other examples.
Going to Pauline Latham. Pauline Latham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How will she encourage young women to pursue further educational training to maximise their earning potential and career prospects rather than feeling pressurised to start a family while still in their teenage years?
My honourable friend is rightly championing the importance of education and has done a lot of work to raise these issues. Where a young woman has been identified as taken out of school, the local authority has a responsibility to locate and contact that young woman and work with them to find a suitable place in post-16 education. The government also provides targeted support to help young people overcome financial barriers to participation through the 16 to 19 bursary fund. Apprenticeships are a job with training, and they benefit people of all ages and backgrounds, especially young people starting their career. The plan for jobs will help to kickstart the nation's economic recovery. As part of this plan, we have introduced a payment of £2,000 for employers in England who hire a new apprentice aged under 25 and £1,500 for employers who hire a new apprentice aged over 25 before 31st of January 2021.
Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the Minister for her answer. Newcastle College in my constituency is a fantastic further education provider which have invested significantly in their facilities and staff for their trainees and the 850 different local employers they support. They've been judged outstanding by Ofsted in all areas, including apprenticeship provision. However, they are concerned about the dramatic reduction in trainee vacancies, and their actual apprenticeship starts are down by 2/3 year on year. So would you join me in praising the work they have done so far, and also set out what incentives employers have not only to take on but also keep on apprenticeships to the end of their training?
I do congratulate Newcastle College on all they're doing to support learners to develop the skills they need to thrive. We know that apprenticeships are proven. 91% of apprentices in 2016-17 remained in employment or went on to further training afterwards. In recognition of the importance of apprenticeships and the disruption caused by COVID-19, the government has introduced payments to incentivise hiring new apprentices and flexibilities to support existing ones through their programmes.
Minister Pack-Batfadden.
Let's look at the record, Mr. Speaker. Capital investment in further education is running at less than half the level put in by Labour 10 years ago. Apprenticeship starts are down 43,000 this year, with the biggest drop among under-19s. And yesterday, we learned about the short-sighted, vindictive move to scrap the Union Learning Fund. Why is it, when the need is for help now with new skills and retraining, that this government has done so much to kick the ladder of opportunity away from working people?
Mr. Speaker, I think it's probably a good time to remind the honourable gentleman that in the budget we have actually increased significantly the amount of money that is being spent on further education. On the decision regarding Union Learn Grant, I would refer him to ministers of the Department for Education who made this decision. I'm sure they can write to him again on this. But the government remains committed to investing in adult skills and retraining. In addition to the plan for jobs and at the CSR, we will be allocating our new £2.5 billion National Skills Fund to help more young people learn new skills and prepare for jobs for the future.
Mary Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good morning. The temporary reduced rate for the tourism and hospitality sectors came into effect on the 15th of July 2020 and is helping to support the cash flow and viability of over 150,000 businesses and to protect 2.4 million jobs across the UK. On the 24th of September, the government announced that it will extend the temporary reduced rate so that it now ends on the 31st of March 2021.
Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we all want to see a sensible solution to the debate over COVID restrictions in Greater Manchester. But a move from Tier 2 means that the hospitality sector in Cheadle faces the additional blow of Tier 3 restrictions. And whilst reduced VAT in recent months has been welcome, businesses in Tier 3 will be unable to benefit from the extended scheme. Therefore, in addition to the comprehensive support package, will the Minister consider extending the reduced VAT scheme further in areas that go into Tier 3 so that they can do business on that basis for as long as those businesses in other parts of the country?
I thank my honourable friend for the question. She will know it has already been extended, and as she'll also be aware, we've put in place a scheme for people who have VAT debt in order to allow a payment process that fits their schedule. As the Chancellor has already said, in order to support local authorities at very high alert to protect public health and local economies, an additional £5 a head, £8 in total has been made available. That means we have committed up to £465 million in funding for English local authorities through the tiering scheme, and we will announce further details of the eligible expenditures under this scheme.
Stephen Timms.
The £20 per week increase in the Universal Credit Standard Allowance and Working Tax Credit Basic element forms just one part of a package of support the government has provided to protect people's jobs and incomes, including income support schemes.
Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government was right to increase universal credit and working tax credit by £20 a week. It would surely now be inconceivable to remove those increases before the pandemic is even over in April as planned. But does the Minister accept that amongst the indirect levers available to the government to stimulate what is, as we've heard already, going to be a weak economy for some time, measures which raise the incomes of low-income households are the most effective, and benefit increases are a very good example?
Well, I'm grateful that the right honourable gentleman recognises the additional £9 billion of support that my right honourable friend has put into the welfare, and I think that is reflected, as he further recognised, in the distribution analysis that has shown that that has protected those on the lowest incomes. Now, that support is temporary, but it does extend to the spring, and it helps those families facing COVID with the challenges over the coming months.
We have a substantive question to Minister Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I will answer this question together with the following question, which I think is question number 21. The government has provided an unprecedented package of support for people, businesses and public services throughout the UK, totalling more than £200 billion. This is including helping to pay the wages of 9.6 million people through the Job Retention Scheme and protecting the livelihoods of 2.6 million self-employed workers through the Self-Employment Income Support Scheme.
Let's head to Scotland with Alan Dorrans. Alan Dorrans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Scottish Government are doing what they can to support individuals, businesses and those who have been excluded by the Chancellor from receiving any grants, loans or payment holidays. They are hampered in doing so by not having the autonomy of having borrowing powers to meet the unique requirements of the Scottish economy. Will the Government heed repeated calls for the devolution of borrowing powers to enable the Scottish Government to provide additional targeted assistance to those individuals and sectors which they have identified as most in need?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Honourable Gentleman will know, the current state of affairs was agreed between the Scottish Government and the UK Government after exhaustive consultation and discussion by the Silk Commission, and that remains the set-up to which the Scottish Government has committed itself.
Let's head and return to Scotland with Douglas Chapman. Douglas Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the dual viruses of Brexit and COVID-19, we're heading for a winter of discontent and a longer period of mass unemployment. With no budget announcement, what are the Chancellor's economic advisors telling him about the government's preparations for mass unemployment and the sectors that will be worst hit?
Well, the Chancellor has been very clear that because we are in the midst of a pandemic, we are likely, and we are indeed already seeing some redundancies. And there's no doubt about the seriousness of the financial and economic situation that we're in. I would remind the Honourable Gentleman with regard to Scotland that there has been some £7 billion of support for the Scottish Government in dealing with the pandemic and the economic effects of the pandemic, over and above the £21.3 billion provided through the regular Barnett process.
Can I welcome to the dispatch box Abena Pongasari's Shadow Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In regions facing Tier 3 restrictions, many businesses have been forced to close. In Tier 2 regions, many businesses, especially in hospitality, are open in name only, running up all the costs without the customers. What does the government have to say to those businesses which realistically can't operate, are not legally required to close?
Well, I welcome the Honourable Lady to her place, and I mourn the loss of her predecessor to his new job, whom I've happily fenced over many sessions of the Finance Bill. The answer to the question the Honourable Lady raises is, of course, that we are acutely aware of the financial costs on those businesses, as we are on businesses that have been forced to close. And that is why we have put in place an evolving and comprehensive programme of support for business.
We now have a substantive question to Minister Bartley. Minister Bartley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hold regular discussions with my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State. The original national business grant schemes provided support to small businesses which face fixed property-related costs during the strict lockdown period.
Let's head to Edmonton with Kate Osmore. Kate Osmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for his reply. But is the Minister aware that in Enfield, only 189 small businesses received the discretionary grant, even though 330 businesses applied for the grant? In view of further restrictions in London, will the Minister commit to urgently releasing extra funding to Enfield Council to ensure that those businesses who previously missed out can reapply for financial support?
Mr. Speaker, the previous grant was for businesses that have been forced to close, and we have allocated, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor has allocated additional funding through the Local Restriction Support Grant Scheme for those businesses that are forced to close with an additional £1,500 per 2-week closure period. But as she said in her question, the previous grant was discretionary, and local authorities therefore had discretion as to how many firms benefited from it.
Andrew Lowe.
Question 24, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I will answer this question together with the following 3 questions. The government's taken unprecedented steps to support the self-employed, as the House will be aware. So far, the government has paid out £13.4 billion of support through the Self-Employment Income Support Scheme.
Andrew Lowe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recently had a Zoom call with Deborah Annetts, the COO of the Incorporated Society Musicians, and Jordan and Steve from a local Northampton band called The Keepers, and they highlighted the problems that self-employed musicians currently face. Can my honourable friend support struggling musicians like The Keepers by considering either a freelance support scheme or a box office top-up to help make socially distanced gigs feasible?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question, and he'll be aware that with a name like Jesse Norman, who, as you know, is an American opera singer, now alas dead, of the same name, and as someone who's been involved in arts organisations and indeed as a pretty incompetent musician himself, I'm extremely aware of the concern that he raises, and rightly so. He will know that the government has announced a £1.57 billion culture recovery fund, of which some £330 million have been awarded to date to nearly 2,000 cultural organisations. And that funding is designed to help performances to restart, to protect jobs and to create opportunities for freelancers across the country. It's worth also mentioning that we've done a considerable amount of work on the film and TV production restart scheme, much of which will have the same effect when it's properly up and running.
Chris Elmore.
Speaker, I've been contacted every day from sole traders and small independents who have fallen through the government's schemes. They are excluded and do not qualify for government support. And according to Excluded UK, 1.6 million people are excluded from any of the government self-support schemes. Now, last week, in answer to my honourable friend, the member for Pontypridd, the Chief Secretary said these people had now been covered. They haven't been covered. These people are excluded. They are desperate for help. Can the Minister set out what support he will provide to the people who are excluded in this country from self-support grants?
Well, I'm sure that whatever the Chief Secretary said last week, he was absolutely correct. I would say this, that he will be aware that the scheme we have is designed to be as comprehensive as we can make it, consistent with the wider package we're offering and with support rapidly for the largest number of the most vulnerable people. That was the purpose of the scheme, and we have continued that theme of supporting self-employed through the job support scheme, and of course it itself forms part of a much wider pattern of support for the industry and for businesses.
John Love.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I very much welcome everything that the Chancellor has done to protect jobs, businesses and livelihoods in my own constituency and across Scotland. Many of the self-employed constituents in my area will be very grateful for the third grant that's now available to them. I wonder if the Minister could set out the number of people who will be eligible for this grant in Scotland.
Well, I think, Honourable Friend, we're unable to predict the exact take-up of the SEISS grant extension across the United Kingdom, but the latest statistics on the second grant demonstrate that self-employed people in Scotland are continuing to receive unprecedented levels of support under the scheme. As of the 20th of September, 64% of assessed individuals were found to be eligible in Scotland, with 126,000 claims being made, amounting to £318 million of government support.
Thank
you, Mr Speaker. My constituent Rebecca launched her new business, Purdy Pet Shop, in Coventry North West just before the lockdown. Rebecca was told she was ineligible for the self-employed support scheme and faced a frustrating few weeks until they were eventually granted a coronavirus business interruption loan. They are just one business amongst many who fell through the gaping holes of the first self-employed support scheme. Now, they and many other businesses in my constituency will also fall through the gap of the new extension. I also have constituents contacting me about how anxious they feel and how they can survive now that the support has dropped to just 70%. So could the Minister please tell me how adequate he believes the extension of the self-employment income support scheme is and what he will do to support my constituents who are falling through the gap of the current scheme and worried about the reduced financial support it now offers?
Well, I thank the Honourable very much for her question, and I salute her constituent for setting up a new business and for showing that entrepreneurship and aspiration that characterises British business at its best. We are, as she will be aware, engaged in the process of supporting vulnerable businesses and people, and we do so in the self-employment area through the extension to the job support scheme. And of course, she will know that that just forms itself one element of a much wider picture, including the loans that she's described, tax deferrals, rental support, and increased levels of universal credit.
So the PAC, make it.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I associate myself with the concerns raised by colleagues cross-party on this issue. But it's interesting that every time the Minister comes to the dispatch box, he bats off extra support for these people. And yet some of them may have qualified for bounce-back loans. I'd be very interested to know if the Treasury knows how many qualify for bounce-back loans, because a recent National Audit Office report suggests that the Treasury doesn't know where the money's gone and what it's being used for. So perhaps he can elucidate.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for, and I admire her ingenuity for introducing a conversation about bounce-back loans into a discussion of a self-employed scheme. The answer to that is that I don't have the numbers to hand, but of course, if those numbers are available, I will make sure that, that we write to her with the detail.
Number 29, please.
Chancellor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to answer this question together with question number 30, if I may. Over the course of the CGRS, over 9 million jobs were protected through the furlough scheme. The job support scheme, which replaces this, will come into force on November 1st. Of course, it's impossible to predict today how many people will benefit. That will depend on the exact path of the virus and the restrictions in place.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Since March, unemployment has doubled in Coventry South, and now the government is replacing furlough with an utterly inadequate job support scheme. Research from the IPPR found that of the 2 million jobs at risk, it will only save 10%. And where it's used by businesses that are required to close, 2/3 of wages is simply not enough for low-paid workers. So I ask the Chancellor, is he happy to see 1.8 million jobs go? And could he live on 2/3 of the minimum wage? If not, he should extend the furlough scheme now for the industries that desperately need it.
Mr. Speaker, when we announced the job support scheme, it was in fact warmly welcomed by several business groups and indeed the trade union, who I was happy to work with in designing the scheme. But I'd say to the honourable member, I take the issue of jobs very seriously. It remains my highest priority, and whilst I cannot protect every single job, we will throw absolutely everything we can at protecting and saving and creating as many jobs as possible, which is why we have a comprehensive plan for jobs, Mr. Speaker. The job support scheme is just one element of that, and indeed I'm pleased to say the Kickstart scheme is shortly due to launch, which will provide hope and opportunity to hundreds of thousands of young people.
That's sharp.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A report published this week by the political consultancy WPI Strategy, commissioned by Tesco, ranked Bradford West number 3 in its need to be levelled up. Last week, another report found my constituency having the highest rising rate of child poverty in Yorkshire and Humber, and the Chancellor will be well aware it also ranked 7th highest in the country for unemployment. With all of this going on and being under local restrictions for almost 3 months now, I asked the Chancellor, does he feel Bradford West can afford any more job losses, and whether he believes that it is in need of targeted support from the Treasury?
Mr. Speaker, in Bradford and elsewhere, we would like not to see any job losses. But the reality is what is happening to our economy is sadly going to mean that many people have already lost their job, almost 750,000, and sadly many more will, which is why our comprehensive plan for jobs aims to protect, support and create jobs in every part of our United Kingdom. That will provide hope and opportunity to people, whether it's the Kickstart scheme, as I mentioned, or whether it is indeed the opportunity for new training and new skills through the Prime Minister's announcement of a lifetime skills guarantee.
Imran Hamad Khan.
Number 31, sir.
The Government has provided significant support to those on low incomes. We have introduced additional support through the welfare system, estimated by the OBR to be worth over £9 billion this year, including increasing universal credit and working tax credit by £20 per week, as well as £500 million of local authority hardship fund and £500 payments for those on low-income households who have to self-isolate.
Hamad Khan.
Over the weekend, I visited numerous businesses in Horbury, such as the Green Berry and the Black Olive Delicatessen. Mr. Speaker, they form a fantastic independent retail offering, which perhaps on your next visit to Wakefield to witness Trinity prevail over your club, a little retail therapy could be a soothing balm on your long journey home across the Pennines. But failing your patronage, Mr. Speaker, business owners there have told me that the imposition of Tier 2 measures has sapped consumer confidence, which is the oil upon which the economy is greased. Will my honourable friend confirm he will use all his creativity to focus HMT's strategy in stimulating confidence in the consumer economy to support these businesses and consider tax reform were it conducive to those aims?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and he's right to draw attention to the support that we've put in place, but also the challenges that remain. In his own constituency, 14,500 have benefited from the furlough scheme, 28.4 million of business grants have been made available, and £20.3 million of business rates relief has also been provided. But looking to the future, I can assure him that all Treasury ministers will be using rigorous analysis and thinking as we work with the Chancellor as we approach the next budget.
Well, Logan.
Question 32, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I will answer this question together with the following one. The pandemic has unfolded at different pace in countries around the world, and countries have acted in a way that works best for their respective economies. In this country, as he will know, the government's put in place some 200, indeed more than £200 billion worth of support to protect people's jobs, businesses and incomes, and that is one of the most comprehensive economic responses of its kind anywhere in the world. Our goal remains to continue to protect those livelihoods, those jobs and those businesses while we allow the economy to adapt to the changing circumstances.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Britain's fiscal support outshines that of our European neighbours, but constituencies like mine have never really emerged from the economic lockdown. Employment in many businesses are being stretched, and the Mayor of Greater Manchester needs to learn from Bolton Wanderers and start playing ball. Will the Treasury constantly review the financial help on offer for those faced with Tier 3 restrictions, and indeed consider some of the ideas that were forthcoming from the Honourable Member for Cheadle in relation to VAT reduction on hospitality industry. Thank you.
Well, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question, and I'm delighted that he draws Bolton Wanderers into a discussion on the floor of the House of Commons, a very fine club. I would say this, he will know that we have committed almost £500 million in support to English local authorities through the tiering system. He will know that that comes on top of £300 million already allocated to local authorities for test, trace and contain activity. And I think he will also and should also be aware that there are grants of up to £3,000 per month, depending on rateable value, through the local restriction support grant, as well as the expansion that the Chancellor has recently announced, the job support scheme. All of that forms part of our comprehensive package.
As a Bolton fan, I expect better results in the future. Harriet Bowley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. At the beginning of the pandemic, the OECD forecast that unemployment in the UK would rise to 9.1% by the end of this year. They've recently revised down their forecast to 5.3%. Can the Minister confirm that the Winter Jobs Plan will continue to provide the right kind of support to help our flexible labour market adapt to the pandemic?
Well, I think to highlight the point about the OECD's forecasts and also the astonishing flexibility and effectiveness of our labour markets. I think she'll know that the government continues to adapt its response, and as the Chancellor has just recently, a few minutes ago, mentioned, we will shortly be launching the £2 billion Kickstarter scheme alongside the job support scheme, and that is, I think, going to be a tremendous boost for prospects of young people across the country.
Simon Clark.
Before, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the government is committed to levelling up opportunities so that all people and places across the UK benefit from economic growth. COVID-19's impacts has made this even more important. From the £2 billion new Kickstart scheme to create new jobs for 16 to 24-year-olds to the £1 billion for local projects to boost local recovery, the Department will protect jobs, support economic growth and boost productivity across all nations and regions of the UK.
My honourable friend for that answer. And of course, one of the best tools to level up economic opportunity across the UK after we leave the European Union will be free ports. Does my honourable friend recognise the very strong case for designating Teesport, and will she praise the work of PD Ports and my friend, the Tees Valley Mayor Ben Houchen, in preparing what is, I think, a very strong bid?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. Free ports will benefit communities across the UK by unleashing the economic potential of our ports, as he will very well know, having done this role that I'm doing now, being one of my predecessors. I would like to thank him, the Mayor of Tees Valley and the Honourable Member for Redcart for their support on this agenda. Our consultation response, published 7th of October, confirms our intent to deliver free ports by 2021, and the free port locations will be selected according to an open, transparent bidding process.
Right, we now come to topicals. Jacob Young.
Mr. Speaker, this government has put in place a £200 billion programme of support to help jobs and businesses throughout this crisis. Although we will not be able to save every single job or business, we remain committed to doing what we can to protect the economy and people's livelihoods at this difficult time.
Jacob Young.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government has taken extraordinary steps to protect the economy, and now we must take the extraordinary steps to unlock the economy. Uncertainty stemming from coronavirus and the volatility in the oil price is leading to delayed investment in the Tees Valley. One thing that could break the deadlock in investment in the Tees Valley would be the announcement of a free port in Teesside. So can my right honourable friend assure the House that he will not delay the rollout of 10 new free ports? And does he agree with me that a free port in Teesside could lead to thousands of new jobs for my constituents in Redcar and Cleveland?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend, together with my honourable friend from Middlesbrough South and East Cleveland, and indeed the Mayor of the Tees Valley, Ben Houchen, are fantastic champions for the free ports agenda, and they are all absolutely right. This is a policy which can unlock investment and growth and therefore create jobs in parts of our country that want to see that growth. I can assure him that I look forward to receiving the bid that no doubt he and his colleagues are putting together for us.
We now come to Shadow Minister Bridget Phillipson with the first of two questions.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm sure the Chancellor will agree that confidence won't return to our economy until we are able to control the virus with an effective test, trace and isolate system. Yet the current system isn't working and was described by SAGE as having a marginal impact on transmission. Can the Chancellor explain why, although he has funded the system generously, it is failing so badly?
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm glad the Honourable Lady recognises we have provided substantial funding for the test and trace system. And of course, whilst there have been times when we would all wish that the response would be faster, and that is indeed what is happening, it's worth bearing in mind how far we have come since the beginning of this crisis, when 10,000 tests or so were being done, where we are now marching towards our target of 500,000 daily tests. That's enormous progress, and that will make a difference in our ability to suppress the spread of this virus.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In March, the Chancellor was clear that if people couldn't earn a living by going out to work, it was the government's job to step in, whatever it takes. By July, he was moving away from that belief, and today he has moved so far that his employment support schemes have more holes than a Swiss cheese. Can he tell the House, was he wrong in March or is he wrong now?
Mr Speaker, I did say we would do what it takes, and I think £200 billion later and almost 9 million jobs protected is evidence that we have done and we will continue to do what it takes to protect this economy and people's livelihoods.
Let's head to Essex with John Barron. John Barron.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The government's economic support packages have been some of the most generous anywhere and essential sticking plasters from which many of our constituents have benefited. But given COVID may be with us some time, and given the economy is in transition, may I encourage the government to think more strategically and perhaps draw lessons from, for example, Margaret Thatcher's Enterprise Allowance Scheme, which helped hundreds of thousands of people over some years transition from unemployment to self-employment.
My honourable friend makes an excellent point, Mr Speaker. We should have an eye on our recovery, and he is absolutely right that entrepreneurship can play an important part in driving that recovery, which is why during the crisis we announced the Future Fund to help provide financing for start-up entrepreneurial companies, and I'm happy to have a look at the Enterprise Allowance Scheme. He will of course also be aware that we do have the Start-up Loan Scheme, which does something similar and provides government discounted and funded loans to those budding entrepreneurs of tomorrow.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The £63 million funding for the Emergency Assistance Grant for food and essential supplies is due to run out at the end of the month. This funding has been a vital lifeline for our community in Liverpool, which has an effective local welfare assistance scheme supporting people facing destitution thanks to Liverpool City Council. Our region is now faced with Tier 3 measures, which makes this funding even more crucial. Will the Chancellor tell the House what discussions he has had with the Secretary of State on extending this essential funding?
Well, Mr Speaker, the honourable gentleman will know that as a result of Liverpool entering Tier 3 restrictions, those conversations have happened with representatives from the government and the Community Secretary to ensure that Liverpool gets the resources it needs to provide extra compliance enforcement and indeed extra funding to provide support for businesses and people during what is, I appreciate, a very difficult time for his constituents.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Last week I formally named the e-Voyager in my home village of Millbrook. The e-Voyager is the UK's first seagoing electric ferry, which will operate from Kreml near Mount Edgecombe Country Park. Will my right honourable friend look at investing further in South East Cornwall, where we have this proven expertise?
Well, Mr Speaker, can I firstly pay tribute to my honourable friend for her work on that important initiative. And she is a champion for levelling up in Cornwall, and this government is committed to working with her, and that is why amongst the package of measures of support it includes the Cornwall Social Housing Retrofit Acceleration and the Cornwall Institute of Space AI as part of a suite of measures working with the very welcome initiative that she has championed.
And it's notable how many members this morning have raised issues of self-employed and freelancers, such as musicians, actors and dancers who have had little or no support throughout the pandemic. So rather than suggest they abandon years of dedication and training, will the Chancellor now consider initiatives such as a universal basic income to protect our valuable arts sector?
We recognise the concern for the valuable arts sector you described, and that's why we've put £1.57 billion towards it. As I've said, 330 million of that has been released. A further release will be made in the next few weeks against those, and that is because we believe in that sector and we support those people. And of course, there are other schemes already in place that those affected can benefit from, and I've already highlighted some of the other schemes: support for independent production, films, etc., which they can also derive benefit from as well.
Christian Wakeford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The events industry and the conference sector has been amongst the hardest hit sectors by the pandemic, being told they will not be assessed until March of 2021. With an anticipated 15 months with little to no income, can my right honourable friend advise what support packages are available to support businesses like Hirex and Exceed in Radcliffe in my constituency?
Well, friend is absolutely right. There are businesses that are experiencing a difficult time, especially in the sectors that he mentioned. Our comprehensive set of interventions, whether that's loans, grants, business rates, holidays, all will provide help in different ways. But I think the most important thing we can all focus on is suppressing the spread of this virus and unlocking those parts of our economy that are unable to function. That is the surest and only way in the long run to protect the jobs that we all care about.
Holmes.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister or Chancellor will know that tax-free shopping is a major source of income for airports like Southampton Airport in my constituency. With the ongoing problems caused by COVID to the sector, this income is even more important. So will the Chancellor or a Minister meet with me and representatives from Southampton Airport to discuss continuing tax-free shopping, which is a valuable lifeline for our struggling aviation industry?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for raising this. As someone with an airport in my own constituency, I fully understand the issues, and I've had various meetings with many stakeholders, and I'm happy to offer Southampton Airport a meeting with Treasury officials to discuss these changes. At the same time as removing tax-free sales from 1st of January 2021, the government is extending duty-free sales to EU-bound passengers for the first time in over 20 years, and this will be a significant boost to regional airports like Southampton, which serve significantly more EU than non-EU destinations and haven't been able to offer duty-free to the EU before.
Let's head to Lewisham with Vicky Foxcroft. Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Alex, is a Blue Badge Guide. Her income is just above the threshold for the Self-Employment Income Support Scheme. The money she has saved to cover her tax bill pushes her over the threshold for universal credit. Despite moving her tours online, Alex is earning very little. Given that the situation looks set to continue, what advice does the Minister have for her and the 3 million other people excluded from the government's COVID-19 financial support?
Minister Norman.
The Honourable Lady very much for the concern she describes and understand the problem. The situation with, as she will know, with people at lower income levels who may also be on universal credit is that it is a flexible benefit which allows the top-up to income received, and that is also true with the support received through the job support scheme for self-employed people as well.
We now come to Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand here as a proud ex-coal miner, and the Mine Workers Pension Scheme has done very well over the past 25 years, with successive governments taking over £4.5 billion in return for guaranteed payments from the government. Would my right honourable friend work with me to ensure that ex-miners and their families get a fairer deal?
Well, I know, Mr. Speaker, this is an issue my honourable friend has championed, and I look forward to my further discussions with him on it. He'll also know that the government and the Mine Workers Pension Scheme have agreed to guarantee the core pension rates in the case of a deficit in the scheme, and have further agreed to protect bonus pensions that have accrued to date. So clear progress, but happy to have further discussions with him.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a devastating impact on the income of medical research charities. This could jeopardise progress in discovering new ways of preventing, diagnosing and treating diseases and their risk factors like air pollution. Given this risk to medical research, what consideration has the Treasury given to the Association of Medical Research Charities' proposal for a Life Science Charity Partnership Fund?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady will know that this government remains absolutely committed to our ambitious plans to double R&D funding over the course of the next few years. We've made enormous progress on that this year with a huge and I think unprecedented increase in R&D funding, which goes both to basic science research, which he talked about, but also ensuring that we can develop those research into actual actionable ideas that benefit people and create jobs. But she can rest assured this remains an important aim of this government to make sure this is the best place to research anywhere in the world.
Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Energy Research Accelerator brings together 9 Midlands research-intensive organisations, including Keele University in my constituency of Newcastle-under-Lyme. With its initial government funding, that secured 23 new research facilities, £120 million of industrial funding and £450 million of total value added in new investments in energy research and development. So will my right honourable friend praise the work they've done and look favourably on their submission seeking further funding to build on their successes to deliver on this government's commitments both to net zero and of course to levelling up?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government appreciates the work that the Energy Research Accelerator has been undertaking across the Midlands on energy innovation. This government has set out its ambition to invest up to £22 billion in R&D by 2024-25. The Chancellor also announced in the spring budget the BEIS Energy Innovation Programme will at least double to £1 billion plus. R&D investment will continue to have a strong regional impact and benefit areas across the UK, including the Midlands.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
The Chancellor will know that food and drink wholesalers, such as Harvest Fine Foods in my constituency, supply both the hospitality sector, where 70% of sales are made, and the public sector, where the other 30% are made. With the closure and reduction of much of the hospitality sector, and without any targeted government support, wholesalers are on the verge of collapse, and with that, the supply of food to institutions such as care homes, prisons, schools and hospitals is at immediate risk. Will he or the Financial Secretary therefore meet with the Federation of Wholesale Distributors to discuss the need for business rates relief to be extended to wholesalers to prevent the dire scenario of the public sector finding...
Dr. Julian Lewis, you know better than to take good advantage of me, and that's not fair to others. Who wants to answer it? Minister Bartlett.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that is why, to address pressures like that, we have set out such a comprehensive package of support which applies universally, including to the businesses to which my right honourable friend refers. But through his question, he also points to another substantive point, which is that suppliers do supply to different sectors. And one of the challenges with the proposals put forward by the benches opposite in extending the furlough was they were never clear as to which sector it was that they wanted to extend to. And the point of suppliers supplying multiple sectors, including the public sector, is a good illustration of why that proposal is flawed.
Final question, Tamjit Singh Desai.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor will be aware that wholesalers play a fundamental role in the food and drink supply chain and, amongst other things, provide vital resources to our schools, hospitals and care homes, yet many are still struggling not having enough government support. Bidfood, based in my Slough constituency, have seen almost 50% downturn in their sales volumes and have been forced to make 7% of their workforce redundant. So I asked the Chancellor, why have they been ignored, and given the increased lockdown measures that are proposed, what measures will he put in place to support struggling wholesalers?
Short now. Done you a favour, don't take up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And obviously, the honourable gentleman raises a similar point to my honourable friend behind me in a coordinated attack. But what I would say to him is they have not been ignored. And whilst I appreciate they are treated slightly differently from the hospitality businesses with which they serve, for the reasons that my honourable friend set out, it is tricky when there are businesses involved in the supply chain. But he talked specifically about them facing reduced demand. The job support scheme is specifically there for businesses which are open but facing reduced demand, and that will allow them, rather than making redundancies, to receive a wage subsidy from the government to help top up those employees' wages. And I hope that that's something that they will look at.
In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I'm suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order.
Colin, are you ready? Gearing to go? Okay. Order. Order. We now come to the 10-minute rule motion on equal pay information and claims. Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill about equal pay as on the order paper. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, you could be forgiven for thinking we've been here before, because women have been asking for equal pay since 1833. The first recorded instance was in Robert Owen's Labour Exchange. I'm sorry to say, as a Co-op MP, it wasn't answered positively. I'm sure the front bencher would agree with me. 188 years later, we are still waiting. Indeed, last year alone, there were 30,000 equal pay claims made at tribunal. So too, this year, we've seen that the gender pay gap is actually increasing, not closing. That means that 9 out of 10 women in this country work in companies or organisations that pay them less on average than their male counterparts, even in 2020. And I want to start by just nailing the myth that that is the fault of the women themselves. It's not because they have kids or because they don't ask for pay rises. The evidence is crystal clear. Absolutely, there is a pay penalty for having a kid. I think all of us are beginning to realise that. But that pay penalty was there before those children were born. And the evidence is also clear that women ask just as often as men for a pay rise, but men are 4 times more likely to receive it. The research shows that the impact of the gender pay gap comes from a mixture of things, including working for less productive companies,